Hello, everyone, and welcome to this British Columbia Social Procurement Initiative Purchasing Power Speaker Series. My name is Tori Williamson from BCSPI Canada, and I will be your moderator today. I respectfully acknowledge that I live, work, and learn on the unceded traditional and ancestral Squamish territory. I endeavor to make this more than just words, and I invite you to consider what it means to live on the traditional lands in your community and what efforts we can all take to repair and improve our relations with Indigenous people locally and globally. And hopefully that land acknowledgement sets the stage for this conversation today, because we're going to be getting tangible with those efforts that I mentioned about that we can be taking when it comes to procurement and how to advance reconciliation with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in the land known as Canada. Following this session, we're going to be sharing a discussion summary as well as the recording, so you can keep an eye out for that in your inbox. Just some quick information about the British Columbia Social Procurement Initiative. BCSPI is by local governments for local governments, and our goal is to help local governments across British Columbia to turn their procurement dollars into achievable and measurable community benefits. It's governed by a steering committee of political and senior staff leads to meet quarterly to decide on our direction, next steps, resources, and services. BCSPI members get support from the service delivery partners, which includes the organization that I work for, BCSPI Canada, Scale Collaborative, and the Vancouver Island Construction Association. And the services that you get access to as a BCSPI member include training and development, one-on-one coaching, project review, social value criteria and weighting, RFX review, policy development, troubleshooting, and evaluation. Basically, we're working hard to think about anything we can do to help support your social procurement journey. Our impact at a glance to date includes over 35 participating governments and organizations, over 150 member staff trained, $200 million spent on social procurement, and over 100 pilot projects undertaken. So great to see that impact. And we've recently released our impact report, our first annual impact report, which is a great summary of the work done so far by BCSPI members and the initiative. Emma shared in the chat. She'll be sharing lots of links today, and she's sharing more about BCSPI membership if that's of interest to you and your organization. So now let's look a little bit closer at the conversation we're going to be having today. Myself, as a settler growing up in Canada, residential schools were honestly just a footnote in social studies class. There was a very low level awareness of the injustices and trauma forced upon Indigenous people, but it wasn't until the indefensible proof of unmarked graves of thousands of children brought reconciliation to the forefront of the Canadian conscience. The work of the residential school survivors to advocate for truth and reconciliation was tireless and cannot go unanswered. Through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, clear and tangible steps have been laid out for all of us to take action and redress the wrongs so we can heal and create a future where all people, children, elders, and the planet live in good relations with each other. So that brings us to our conversation here. With social procurement, we look at how we can bridge our economic purchasing activity with our social, environmental, and cultural goals. Of the many recommendations and calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we're going to be focusing on call to action number 92 today, which states, in order to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission makes the following calls to action. We call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a reconciliation framework, and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. This would include, but not be limited to, the following. Commit to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. Ensure that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. Provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So this calls on corporations to engage in socioeconomic reconciliation. And when local governments buy things, they are engaging in commerce. Heck, many even call themselves corporations. So a key action in alignment with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission call to action number 92 is for local government purchasers to use procurement to advance reconciliation. So with that, I set the stage to speak with some fantastic speakers today. Really looking forward to the conversations that we're going to get to have. At first, I'd like to welcome Janine Kruse, the Regional Municipality of Wood Buffalo Manager of Indigenous and Rural Relations. Janine, can you please take a minute to introduce yourself and your organization?
Thank you, Tori. Good afternoon, everyone. Kansai, Galante. My name is Janine Kruse. I, like Tori said, work with the Regional Municipality of Wood Buffalo, often referred to here as the RMWB. So if I happen to say that, that's what that means. So it is located in Treaty 8 territory, which is, of course, the traditional land of the Cree Dene and the Métis people, and often referred to as Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo. So within the organization, I am a manager with the Indigenous and Rural Relations Department. And really our overall objective within this department is to be a resource both internally for other departments, but also externally for rural residents and Indigenous communities and partners. So geographically, we're quite large. We're, for those that might not know, the northernmost part of the municipality, which is at the border of Northwest Territories, and then all the way south through to Conklin, which is close to Lac La Biche. So quite a large geographical area. And really with the overall goal of building and strengthening relationships. So we are home to 6 First Nations, 6 Métis communities, and our office being in central Fort McMurray, which of course is known for its economic strength and opportunity in the oil sands. So I'm really pleased, thank you, Tori, to have been invited here today to share with you some of the work that our department and organization does, not only as it relates to Call to Action 92 and economic reconciliation, and specifically through procurement, of course, but also hopefully perhaps through some other ways, which I think at the end of the day, overall is moving us forward along the path of reconciliation to a restored sense of well-being for all Indigenous people. So thank you.
Thanks, Janine. Next, I'd like to welcome Matthew Foss, who's joining us from the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, where he's the Vice President of Research and Public Policy. Matthew, if you'll take a minute to introduce yourself and your organization, please.
Thank you, Tori, and appreciate being involved in this important discussion. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And as Tori mentioned, I'm working for the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. I'm coming to you today from Edmonton, which is the traditional territory, Treaty 6 peoples and the Métis. I'm an economist by training with roughly 20 years public policy expertise, and it's a pleasure to have joined the CCAB and to help advance Indigenous businesses. The CCAB itself is a national Indigenous-led member-based organization that works to improve the economic self-reliance of Indigenous communities and assist corporate businesses. We've been around for roughly 40 years, and we are nonprofit and nonpartisan. Roughly 1,900 members across Canada, with roughly 2/3 of those being Indigenous owned. We are a bridge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses. And of course, one of our main focuses is on procurement, as we believe procurement is an important aspect of economic reconciliation. We've got a number of important programs to help and assist with respect to this, certifying Aboriginal businesses, helping non-Indigenous business with progressive Aboriginal relations, or ensuring that they have appropriate Indigenous involvement in their communities and are interacting and interrelating with Indigenous communities in an appropriate manner. And of course, many other tools to assist Aboriginal businesses, along with conference and events, and of course, where my team's focus is research. Thank you, Tori.
Thanks, Matthew. And next we have Tim Laronde, the National Director of Indigenous Strategies at Chandos Construction. Welcome, Tim. You can speak for a minute about yourself and your organization.
Excellent. Thanks, Tori, and thanks again for the invitation to chat about this very important topic. So my name is Tim Laronde. As Tori mentioned, I'm the National Director of Indigenous Strategies for Chandos Construction. I'm also a proud member of Nipissing First Nation, which is in the Robinson-Huron Treaty area, which is our community is about 3.5 hours north of Toronto. I work out of the Toronto office, presently in British Columbia right now. And the role, Chandos is we describe ourselves as a national technical builder, largest B Corp certified general contractor in North America. We talk about purpose. Purpose means using business as a force for good. So we do a lot of work with Bisocial Canada. We look to balance people, profit, and the planet. The role I play as National Director of Indigenous Strategies was a new role that was created coming up on 2 years ago. And really was the focus was to look at ways that we could work with First Nation and Indigenous communities from a construction part, but also from a reconciliation standpoint. So this topic is very timely. The role I play as Chandos can be broken down into 4 key areas. I do a lot of cultural awareness, Indigenous cultural awareness presentations, talking about the history, basically focusing on the milestones pre-contact to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action, what we need to do as a country moving forward. The second area I focus on is looking and providing opportunities for Indigenous talent within our organization. The third area, which is today's topic, is Indigenous procurement. So we want to make sure we have at least a 5% minimum on our Indigenous procurement on all our projects. We'll have probably 120 projects ongoing anytime across Canada. It's important that we work with the communities in our marketplace to make sure that they're included in the project, and we'll delve into that a little bit more later. And the last area I focus on is what I just call business development. So we operate out of 7 districts across Canada: Ottawa, Toronto, Edmonton, Red Deer, Calgary, Kelowna, and Vancouver. And I work with and support the district teams in building relationships with the Indigenous communities in the marketplace, anything from providing capacity building to just building that trusting relationship, and making sure that our partners are included in a lot of our projects moving forward. So looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks, Tori.
Great. So excited to have you all here. And I think it's not an accident that we have here in this conversation a municipality purchaser, a construction supplier, and then an intermediary. So you'll each have different perspectives on how reconciliation can be a part of procurement. So that's kind of what I'd like to learn a little bit more about, how you or your organization are working to reconciliation through procurement. So Tim, maybe we'll start with you. You've touched on that a little bit with your 5% target. Tell us a little bit more about what your organization is doing and what you're doing.
Okay, thanks, Tori. When I took on the role just a couple of years ago, I should also mention that our president, Tim Colbell's First Nations from Mohawks Bay Quinte, and him and I both got our status through Bill C-31. We recognize that there is a tremendous opportunity to reach out to communities and to be inclusive with them in this whole in the business side. Tori, I'm glad you brought up the call to action number 92, because when I first had to look at putting the strategy together, it was based on the call to action number 92. We wanted to make sure that was the foundation for our Indigenous strategy. So in all aspects, and within that, there's procurement. Matthew, one of your former bosses, JP Gladue, a good friend of mine, would say that economic reconciliation is when First Nation communities go from managing poverty to managing wealth. And I think what we need to do in terms of working towards reconciliation through procurement is, what can we do as an organization that will help create wealth in the communities in our area. And one of the ways we can do that is supporting their businesses. We put targets, as I mentioned earlier, on our projects to make sure that we have at least 5% Indigenous participation. And when we get the opportunity to work with projects that are actually in the communities itself, that number gets pretty high. And we've had some communities set goals of 80% Indigenous inclusion in the projects. And the whole concept really is by keeping the money in the community. So by creating wealth, it's going to have other spin-offs in terms of creating jobs and creating opportunities for members of the community and the young people. By engaging the businesses within the community, it allows the business owners to be part of the project and also gives them the opportunity to create wealth for themselves and their community as well. So I guess the big difference is that we're being more proactive on that approach in terms of reaching out directly to the communities as we get these projects, where in the past, the communities may have never been consulted before. So it just becomes a priority, and it works not only for our Indigenous strategy, but it's also part of our B Corp principles as well. As you know, Tori, is reaching out to equity-seeking groups, and unfortunately, Indigenous falls into that category. So that's a little bit of what we're doing here, and continuing to do that with Chandos.
And I think that note on consultation is really interesting and key, because I'd like to hear from Janine next, because you've been a part of the process for developing an Indigenous procurement program at the RMWB it has involved a lot of consultation. It'd be great to hear about your approach to working towards reconciliation through procurement.
Sure. Yeah, so our organization, Tim there spoke about Call to Action 92 really being the foundation. And so the calls to action were really central to this work beginning. So the municipality has adopted 29 calls to action out of the 94, and Call to Action 92 being one of those. And so our organization began talking about procurement, but specifically Indigenous procurement. It's been talked about for some time, but in 2021, we really started to move forward and really advance that work. And like you said, so through engagement, we believe that, this really needs to be done in collaboration with Indigenous partners. And so there's been a lot of engagement with Indigenous businesses, communities that have really resulted in two things that we now know for sure. One being the development of an Indigenous procurement practice, or Indigenous procurement practices within the municipality, is really a critical step that needs to be taken toward furthering economic reconciliation, and directly does respond to that Call to Action 92, but also that this work is key not only in furthering economic reconciliation, but critical to building stronger relationships with Indigenous communities, businesses, and entrepreneurs in the region. So that's been kind of the stance that we've taken, is really working together through a principled approach. So really looking at the relationship and what we value within the relationship that we have with one another, and how do we voice that within the work that we're doing.
Great, thanks, Janine. And so Matthew, you're working in that intermediary context and in that research space too. How is your organization working towards reconciliation through procurement?
Yes, this is such an important topic. The CCAB released some great work, and we do a number of research pieces related to procurement. In 2019, we released our Industry and Inclusion report, which identified and looked at federal government procurement and advocated for setting up a target of 5%, commensurate with essentially the Indigenous population percentage of Canada. Indigenous people make up 5% of Canada. They should get 5% of the business, and really applaud organizations like Tim's that have that specifically mandated into their organization as well. I mean, it's not just government, but all organizations should be following a similar example. That work in industry inclusion showcased that Indigenous businesses span the spectrum of opportunities and have capacity to fill the procurement opportunities across a whole host of of opportunities within government, but also within other businesses. From that, we have continued to advocate for Indigenous businesses and Indigenous procurement. One of the main components of the CCAB is our supply chain program, which has 5 pillars to it: a marketplace, which helps connect businesses, those looking to procure, and those that are available to source those opportunities. A certified Aboriginal business list, in which we take the time to actually make sure that businesses that claim to be Indigenous are actually Indigenous. Procurement champions, which groups like Tim's company are procurement champions that actually make Indigenous procurement a focal point of some of their work and help champion that. We also have forums to help share best practices and are looking to advance a campaign for procurement going forward.
Great, thanks, Matthew. That's a great resource too through your supply chain program. And I know that I believe your certified Aboriginal business directory is available publicly on your website. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic resource for folks to access. So maybe I'll stick with you then, Matthew. And I do see that there is a question in the chat, and we are going to have some time for audience Q&A at the end. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and then we'll get to those towards the end. But Matthew, my next question for you is, in your experience and work kind of outlining what's needed for reconciliation through procurement, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered?
Quite a few, actually. The first is stereotyping with respect to businesses and actually not identifying and acknowledging that Indigenous businesses have the capability to fulfill needs. Additionally, a lot of challenges around the form of procurement. Oftentimes, procurement processes tend to be very onerous and burdensome, and that can often be a real impediment to small businesses of any type trying to get involved, but particularly those with Indigenous leadership. A lack of relationships, that of actually not investing the time and effort into cultivating and establishing a relationship that allows for good dialogue and communication to happen between procurement officers and potential businesses that could participate. And that, of course, leads to a lack of awareness of the opportunities that exist on both sides, from those that want to craft them, as well as those that might want to participate. And I think another challenge as well is the format of many procurement opportunities, that they don't necessarily afford and allow for enough time and effort to build the capacity or certainty that would be required for training that helps Indigenous businesses become part of the supply chain.
Great. Okay. Well, we're going to hear from other panelists too, so we'll see if you didn't cover all the bases, but that's very thorough, and I think you've really hit the nail on the head a lot of some of the challenges that folks can encounter. Janine, maybe I'll go to you. Is there any other challenges that you've seen in the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, sure. So I think Matthew spoke to, quite a couple that we of course experience as well, which is really, it's challenging to foster a culture of awareness internally, and one that is really essentially built on trust and understanding. So, I mean, that Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationship, it's really critical that we get that right? This is the foundation of reconciliation, and we need to ensure that Indigenous peoples and communities are positioned to actively engage in regional economic development opportunities, right? Whether that's enhancing industry players or investment opportunities. At the end of the day, it's really about prosperity for all. And so, of course, like Matthew said, operating within kind of hopefully this concept of unconscious biases, right? Like for a long time, not being able to deliver products competitively in contrast to non-Indigenous businesses. So reconciliation really through or within the supply chain of the country is really important in closing that gap through Indigenous economic development. So this in turn just, you know, creating wealth and jobs, and that's essential to the well-being of Indigenous people, but communities and regions and people overall. So yeah, those are a couple of the challenges, but also just like a lack of making sure that there is inclusion in the design of the projects and programs that we're undertaking, and that really, you know, the Indigenous economy can't exist within programs and services. It really needs to be centered in relationships and economic empowerment, inclusion, and visibility. So that's sometimes hard to get across and have that understanding and awareness.
Yeah. Wow. I think you really touched on a couple of different things there. You know, the depth when we talk about culture and relationships, like that becomes about how do individuals become a part of this journey on reconciliation so that their work that they are doing reflects their own awareness and an ability to form relationships. So absolutely. And we'll go to Tim next. What about you? What are the challenges that you've seen?
I think it's been touched on, but I'll make it a bit clearer from my point, the way I look at it. When I talk about the role I play, the first role I play is I talk about cultural awareness. And there's a reason for that. It's because I believe that's the most important part. So one of the challenges I think is that there's still a lot of uncertainty or knowledge about Indigenous history by a lot of people. And when I deliver cultural awareness presentations, the two reactions I usually get are, the first one is I did not know. And I always say it's okay, because to be honest with you, I didn't know about my own culture growing up either. I found out about my Indigenous heritage later in my life, and I got my status through Bill C-31. The second area, which kind of warms my heart, is people will say, well, what can I do to help? And that to me talks about the concept of being an ally. And Indigenous people welcomed Europeans way back when, and it was meant to work together. And throughout history, when Canada became a country, that's when things, and the Indian Act was formed, that's when things went offside. So the whole part about the challenges is that people understand what Indigenous people have been through in terms of their history, and recognizing that they were here for thousands of years before European settlers, recognizing that they had trade systems, they had commerce, they had governance, they had all those things in place, because they wouldn't have survived if they didn't. So I think the whole concept of just taking the time to learn more about the culture and understanding the culture, I think will overcome that challenge about, well, can they do the job, or can they be competitive? All these things. You're going to find that there's a lot of very successful Indigenous businesses that are supporting our economy, and it's up to us to provide that opportunity and support to help them succeed.
Great. And so on that note, what are the opportunities? You know, if it's up to us, where are the opportunities that you've been a part of or seen?
Is this for me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So when I hear each one of these challenges, maybe I'm an optimistic guy, I see opportunity. So when I hear that there's stereotypes and myths that are about Indigenous people and Indigenous businesses, the opportunity is to showcase and prove them wrong. That there are some successful businesses, organizations like the CCAB that really profiles and recognizes excellence
in Indigenous leadership and Indigenous businesses. We need to continue to tell those stories. We need to continue to showcase some of the successes of Indigenous folks. And for non-Indigenous people or allies, it's sometimes it's a bit uncomfortable to learn about the history, or maybe it's easier to turn away. But if you'll see in history that most successful leaders have dealt with discomfort and dealing with these opportunities and these challenges by turning them into opportunities. I think you're going to see a lot more involvement with the Indigenous economy and just businesses being included in the economy, and there's huge potential. I think 5% is, as Matthew mentioned, is the target we should be shooting for, but I can see that grow as we break down some of these barriers and myths.
Great, thanks, Tim. And when you're implementing Indigenous businesses and cultural awareness in your procurement process, are there any specific implementation opportunities that you've really seen maybe common themes on?
Yeah, what we try to do is so if we're working in a city that is in the traditional territory of a First Nation or a tribal council, what we will do is we will reach out to the surrounding communities for support and early engagement. We're working on a project in Peterborough called the Canadian Canoe Museum, and there's 4 First Nations in that area. And when I got involved with our construction teams and the implementation through the phase, I spoke with the leadership of the Canadian Canoe Museum, and it was very comforting to see that they already had done some consultation and discussions. And it's basically making them part of the team and having them have a say. So not only did we have opportunities to employ some people in those communities, there's 4 communities surrounding Peterborough, we also got them involved in terms of the design of the building as well, because it is in the traditional territory. It's in the Williams Treaty area. And what made it even better was that, it's a canoe museum. So how can you talk about the history of canoes without including Indigenous people? And so not only are they involved in the design, they're also involved in the exhibits and the signage and part of the programs and the history of making that museum very successful. So that's just a small example, I think, of how to implement those opportunities. But I think what you have to do is you have to go with a mindset that's been touched on already about just being more inclusive and recognizing who are the neighbors, who are the communities in that area, whose traditional territory are you building this on? And let's reach out to them to get their input into this project and their ideas as well.
Great, thanks, Tim. And Janine, I'd love to hear from you. What do you see as opportunities in implementation or otherwise?
Yeah, I think that Indigenous procurement, it's of course an important driver of economic reconciliation. And not only does it generate revenue for Indigenous businesses, but it forms relationships. It's an opportunity to really form relationships between corporations and governments. And it really works to really center the relationship towards understanding the importance of that Indigenous relationship, not only in the country, but in each of our provinces as well. So, an opportunity to build understanding and expand that understanding and shift language towards a language of inclusion and design, and being able to create the space for shaping that relationship for positive outcomes, really. So to us and the work that we've done here, that is central and really critical to the concept of economic reconciliation.
And I think what everyone's speaking to is really acknowledging that this takes time. It takes resource, it takes intention, it takes people going out and meeting other individuals and communities and having conversations. And I think there's a part of this that is shifting the way that we could be used to doing things in a mindset of, okay, I'm going to post a bid and expect a response in 2 weeks, and that's who's going to get it. And I think we have to really change the way we expect the processes to work, as Matthew mentioned, like really shifting that expectation to be more relational and to take the time to build and connect with others. Great. And Matthew, what do you see as some of the opportunities around implementation or otherwise?
Yes. Wow. I mean, these engagement pieces are just so critical, right? 4 out of 5 Indigenous communities have median incomes that are below the poverty line, and we see the dependency on government transfers as main source of incomes in these communities increasing as opposed to decreasing over time. And nobody wants this, right? Procurement is the answer and a large source to solving this. Indigenous people have thrived on Turtle Island for millennia. And as Tim mentioned, much of the challenges were brought about by colonialism and Indian Act. Indigenous entrepreneurs are very resilient. We've seen this time and time again in the work that the research that we undertake. And you see this in so many stories of success and abundance, and that with Indigenous businesses, Indigenous entrepreneurs that we profile with respect to some of our awards, some of the speeches in that we encounter in, and the success stories of so many successful businesses that are Indigenous run. And that Indigenous people are the fastest growing population demographic within Canada. They are the youngest. They have so much potential and opportunity to offer Canada's economy with simple changes around procurement processes and that make them more accessible. Those that focus more on recognizing the importance of building capacity and recognizing some of these social development aspects of the procurement such that it transforms communities and economies. Indigenous businesses tend to hire Indigenous people. They're located in Indigenous communities, and so they've got access to that. They give back and become pillars of their communities to help advance the social well-being across the community. And so these are so fundamental and important with respect to how you build success. And it isn't such a challenging process. It really is about just minor modifications and recognizing, as Tim mentioned, getting out and engaging with the communities and ensuring that some of their priorities are met with respect to what it is you're trying to do as a business or government, such that those community priorities become part of what you're trying to accomplish in your procurement.
And Matthew, you mentioned success stories, and that's kind of what I want to explore next. So do you have a success story that you'd like to share with us?
I don't know that I have a specific company that I want to single out and name. A little bit selfishly, I don't want to toot the horn of one of my members without tooting the horn of all of them. But there are so many examples of companies that have grown and expanded and are working through. Work we've done shown that entrepreneurs within the Indigenous space are almost twice as likely to implement new processes and technologies than non-Indigenous businesses. They are as likely or more likely to engage in international export. They are more likely to engage technical solutions with respect to their businesses. There are so many ways and means in which Indigenous entrepreneurs show themselves to be leaders despite all of the challenges in which they have grown up with in Canada.
Great. Thanks, Matthew. And Janine, what about you? Are there any success stories that you've seen in Fort McMurray and in Wood Buffalo?
Yeah, I mean, in a broader sense, just having this conversation today in and of itself is a success. You know, I've been working within the municipality for some time, and there hasn't always been, there has been resistance in the past to Indigenous procurement specifically. And so the fact that our organization has evolved past that to a place where this is part of an important discussion that we're having and looking to achieve, I think that in and of itself is successful. And, you know, so that speaks broadly to our mayor and councillors in their strategic plan, not only within the 2018 to 2021, but also the 2022 to 2025. So this council now has made truth and reconciliation and those calls to action a priority of this organization. So for 8 years, this is a fundamental part of everyday language and design that we have as part of an organization. So I'm really, really proud of that. And I feel like that's a success story. But more specifically around procurement, I think, you know, going back to what both Tim and Matthew have spoken about, which is engagement and the importance of that. And when developing or looking to develop an Indigenous procurement strategy, creating a working group and taking that principled approach and really, yes, there are KPIs and outcomes that are important, and that's not that will always be the case. But I think, you know, more of a willingness to look at the process of how we get to those outcomes and KPIs together. That process itself is reconciliation. It's not always about the outcomes. It definitely needs to be about how we work together to get there. And we have, I think, more willingness in government. We're very, this is A and this is how we get to C and we're going to do B. And so the fact that we're taking the time to define that together as we go, to me, that's a success story.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a definitely a success. Congratulations on all that work and how far you've come. Tim, what about you? We heard a little bit about Peterborough. Are there any other success stories you'd like to share?
Yeah, there's a few of them since I've taken on this role. I think
The one that stands out that really covers this topic is we won a contract to build a high school in Big Stone Cree Nation, which is about 4 hours north of Edmonton, outside Wabasca. And one of the things that we did, first of all, that was really cool is the design team consulted with the community and the kids in the school in terms of what they wanted, because a lot of their kids, once they finished primary school, they'd go off reserve, and that they found that the dropout rate was high, and the lack of graduation, I guess. And they figured that if they could keep the school within the community and keep it to a Cree curriculum, it would be much better, if not only for the kids, but for the opportunity and hope. So when we built, we're in the process of building this right now. And before we had the groundbreaking ceremony, about 3 weeks prior, we held a job fair / trade fair directly in the community. And it just warmed my heart that we had over 75 names of individuals and businesses that wanted to be part of this project. And being the general, we ensured that, you know, we listened to what our client wanted, and we ensured that not only was this going to happen with us, but all the subtrades that we hired as well. So now we're getting to the process of, you know, the electrical, mechanical, plumbing, and we're starting to see the subtrades coming in and utilizing Indigenous businesses in that area and hiring local folks that maybe get a chance at starting a trade or starting a career in construction. So what was interesting is I took that template and I shared it with the other districts about how to successfully engage a community and getting involved, and it's worked in other areas. And you can even take that for projects that are off reserve, that are not Indigenous, that really want to focus on reconciliation. So a lot of municipalities that I see on this call, that, you know, by working with the communities in your traditional territory, engaging them early on in the process and including them in the projects, will reap benefits and rewards that will really, you know, capture the spirit of reconciliation in terms of providing opportunity and providing that economic wealth that a lot of our communities really need. So I hope to have more success stories to share in the future, but this was a great one to start. And I think we're just going to kind of build on that going forward.
And maybe a template to share. Sounds like that would be a valuable tool for many.
Yes, exactly.
Fantastic. So we'll head out to the audience for questions. The first one that we got was from Rachel. Looks like Rachel might not be here anymore. Her question was for Matthew. Have you achieved the 5% target your organization has targeted? If so, is there a strategy to maintain or increase this KPI? Matthew, I'm not sure if that was your recommendation of a target, or was that the target you've set for CCAB internally?
So that's a recommendation that we have set for governments and for private sector as well. We don't track it ourselves in terms of our organization. However, we have a preference to always source where we can from our membership. Indigenous businesses in our membership is a priority for us. And when we can't from there, obviously we look to an Indigenous business as the second. And only when neither of those is available to us, we would look at a non-Indigenous business to procure from.
And would you recommend a strategy if organizations are hitting that 5% target for maintaining or increasing it?
Well, I think, reporting on it and being accountable with respect to it is helpful, and just, continuing to tailor your approach in your procurement to be inclusive.
Absolutely. I think I put down the gauntlet in one of my other recent presentations, and we want more public reporting of what's been achieved. And I think that that's going to be really great to see organizations taking that on.
Tori, can I just add a comment to that?
Of course.
And it's a bit of a shout out. There's an organization called NISTOLink, and what they do is they measure the addressable spend for either social procurement or Indigenous procurement on a lot of jobs, and we're piloting them in Vancouver. And what it does is it allows you to track, and I think there was a discussion earlier about KPIs and just measuring to make sure that we're doing it. So it's great having organizations like NISTOLink out there that can help ensure that we are kind of delivering on what we say we're going to deliver.
Great. Thanks for that. And next we've got Johnny Vuxen, who says that he is 100% owned Aboriginal construction real estate company based in Toronto that just recently signed up with CCAB. He's looking forward to learning more about Indigenous procurement opportunities. Tim or Matthew, any tips for Indigenous businesses out there for learning more about opportunities, or Janine? Anybody?
Yeah,
I think.
Go ahead, Matthew.
Well, just to stay active with respect to what's going on with our membership, and following our newsletter and engaging others in that network.
And what I was going to add is Indigenous procurement is something that we do. So my contact information, I think, is available. So please reach out. I live in the Toronto area. Like to learn more about the business in terms of what they can do to support. And what we do is in each district, we have we're keeping a tracking list or creating a list and adding to it of Indigenous businesses that we would work with on certain projects, trying to match skill sets and availability and capacity and all those things. So absolutely, please reach out to me.
And I think that speaks really strongly to the idea around relationships, is having, a key public contact that businesses can reach out to and let you know about them. I think that's a really strong practice. Janine, maybe curious from you of anything that you've seen at the RMWB that's working well as far as Indigenous businesses reaching out to the municipality.
I think we've got a pretty receptive, not only senior leadership team, but council and mayor as well. So I think that over the last few years, there's been a lot of effort gone into building that relationship, and we're at a place where people feel comfortable being able to reach out to have those personal conversations and express concerns or identify ways that we can better work together. So I think that, like you said earlier, Tori, it takes time, right? There's not one sole thing that someone can do, or there's not one sole person that can fix a certain problem. It's really time and continual effort and action, I think, is really important. So it's still something that we're learning about and we're working on, but that's kind of a process that we're looking to continue to be a part of.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. And we have here in the chat, D. Tompkins from the city of Kelowna says they would love Aboriginal companies to reach out directly if they have goods or services to sell to them. So always, it's hard to cold call and cold email and probably doesn't always have the best return rate, but always worth, if there's somebody in your area, a purchaser, reach out, make an introduction, and you never know. They might be like Tim or Janine and be able to follow up. The next piece in the chat we have is Andy Cohen, who says Kia ora from New Zealand. Loving this webinar, thank you. And he shared a link to an article around how the Maori economy is booming and will be worth $100 billion by 2030. And I know Carol Ann Hilton has talked a lot about her work in Indigenomics, about the $1 billion Indigenous economy. So it's fantastic to see that happening elsewhere and see it continue to grow. I think that comment of moving from managing poverty to managing wealth really resonated with me. And I think procurement is part of how organizations across Canada can be a part of that transition and that booming economy. The next question we have here is from Liz DeBoscher from BCLC. She recently learned about the platform called Nation Talk. Is this something that is widely used within the community? What are the pros and cons of using a platform like this? I don't know, is anybody familiar with Nation Talk? Tim?
I'm familiar with Nation Talk. A gentleman, Don Barraclaw, runs that. It's basically a news service that disseminates and spreads or shares any news that's applicable to Indigenous communities. So it's like a news wire, but on their platforms, and I subscribe to them. They put there's a lot of job postings on there as well, and there's a lot of stuff like contracts for either people posting, non-Indigenous entities posting on there saying that we need an RFP for this or that. So it's I would highly recommend if anyone's not familiar with it to become familiar with it. It's Nation Talk, and to me it's almost like a direct access to a lot of First Nations. There's a lot of information about First Nations, and like I subscribe to, and I get daily updates. So would highly recommend it.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. It's always good to know those resources that are available. And I think a lot of the work I've been exposed to around reconciliation is really going to the conversations where they're already happening, find the Indigenous communities. They don't ask Indigenous people to come to you all the time. Go to them, go to events, make those relationships in person, find those news opportunities that you can connect directly. The next question is for Janine from Michelle Lackey from Exchange Intercity. And she asked, does Wood Buffalo report publicly on which Indigenous companies you contract with in a single report, or would somebody have to sift through city documents to learn about that?
Thanks, Michelle, for the question. To my knowledge, it's not available in a public, one report. However, I think as we advance through the development of the strategy, we're always looking at ways that we can improve transparency and reporting. So not that I'm aware of, however, happy to follow up with Michelle directly to that question if need be, but at this time, to my knowledge, not available in one public report.
And I think that's an evolution in the practice too, is that reporting piece, figuring out the systems, tracking and measuring, gathering that data and releasing it publicly. Yeah, it will be great to see over time, maybe some of this information being shared. Awesome. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I'd like to go to the panelists and ask each of you, what is one concrete action that you would recommend people in the audience can take to look to how procurement can advance reconciliation? Matthew, let's start with you.
One, I think it's to just emphasize and recognize and maintain momentum towards a 5% target. And just set it, measure it, and continue to track towards it.
Great. Thanks, Matthew. Tim?
I'm always going to go back to what I think is a priority is take the time to learn about the Indigenous history and the Indigenous culture. It is surprising that it is getting a lot of attention in the media,
but there's still a lot of people out there that don't really understand our history. And I think the more we educate ourselves about our history, the more we can make informed opinions about the subject matter. And to me, it's the basis of the foundation of understanding how to build relationships with Indigenous communities and how to engage with Indigenous businesses. And if you have an understanding of the culture, I think it's going to be the basis of a great relationship.
Great. And I think, as you mentioned, you know, seeing more content, Indigenous content in media and curating your own media, you know, exposing yourself to films, social media, Instagram channels, like these are all opportunities that you can just shift the culture of our own environment to create a greater cultural awareness and understanding.
Yeah, and it can be a little bit uncomfortable, like as I mentioned earlier, but it's a sad history, but I think it needs to be in order for it to provide impact and understanding. So, but it's sometimes I look that our culture is hiding in plain sight sometimes, and it's a beautiful culture. And you know, the opportunity I get to go into communities, it makes me very proud, and to see the accomplishments of some of these businesses and seeing communities be successful, I think is like a hit on my heart. So it's great to see.
Great, thanks, Tim. And Janine, what is a concrete action you'd recommend people in the audience can take?
What Tim said. Yeah, I do agree. I think education is really important, and embarking on like a journey of collective education and people taking accountability and responsibility for their own education and understanding. That's really important. And you know, you mentioned Carol Ann Hilton. So I mean, Tori, that in of itself, that book Indigenomics, if everybody could just go out and like, she is just a genius of a human being. She's got some great words. It's all available in one book. And one thing she said that sticks out to me is that true reconciliation happens when it creates a positive shift in the lived realities of Indigenous people. So that's well-being, employment, access to opportunity. And if it doesn't do that, it's not reconciliation. So keeping that at the forefront when you're having these conversations and listening, that's so important, is learning and listening. So that's what I would say.
Great. And you didn't mention the course that you have available on your website, which I think is fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, there's lots of resources out there, and that's one of them, but there's just so many that there's really no reason not to have an understanding or an awareness anymore. It's there, and you just need to access it and find it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I encourage folks to check out that RMWB course, as well as the Indigenous Canada course offered to the University of Alberta, and many, many other resources. So thank you so much to each of you, Janine, Tim, and Matthew, for coming here today and sharing your wisdom and experience with us. And I hope that everyone who's listening will leave with some tangible actions and inspirations to move forward with reconciliation, and think about, really, as you just said, Janine, how it can shift and improve the well-being and lived experience of Indigenous people on Turtle Island. So thank you, everybody, for joining this British Columbia Social Procurement Initiative Purchasing Power webinar. We'll be back on, great challenging question here. We'll be back on December 15th to discuss how can procurement support zero waste. So please consider registering and joining us for that session, and we'll continue this speaker series. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Tori. Thanks, everybody.
Tori.